This is module 2. So we're really going to be looking at how to optimize this idea of the inner context. And this is, again, that first pillar of future intelligence, and how that inner context starts to shape the outer content for foresight, strategy, or innovation. So we're going to be looking a little bit at mindset and different states, how those can be kind of thought about, differentiated, maybe even integrated. Looking at how to optimize the inner context, and also looking at what does it mean to be kind of goal aligned, having a goal aligned awareness, and being able to be more future ready from this perspective of the inner context. Okay. So again, this is the first pillar of the 6, and we really see this one as the foundational pillar, right? So it's if you get this one right, then a lot of good things can happen. And if you get it wrong, or don't get it at all, then sure, you're going to get results. It's not like you're not going to get results. You're going to get results, but maybe they're not optimized. And I would say that in the work that I've done and seen and even been trained at, is that people neglect this first pillar. We don't take really seriously how to set the inner context properly and how that influences the outer context. And it really starts with leadership, because leadership really starts to set the emotional, cognitive context for all the interactions of the organization. People's physiology, whether they're aware of it or not, is constantly feeding off the person who's the leader in the room. And this person might not be the person who has the title of leadership, right? So a leader can emerge strictly from their physiology, and our bodies and brains know it, even if our titles don't show it. Okay. And again, just a reminder, kind of this kind of bigger framework we're looking at is that context fits over here on the way that it shapes the content for those other pillars. And then that's going to then, from that content of those pillars, we're going to start to create this dominant future goal frame here on the right side. And that's really going to form our understanding of what's possible and probable, preventable. That's going to influence strategy, decision-making scenarios, right? So there's a little bit of this kind of linear process, although, this is all kind of happening all at once for the brain, right? It's happening very quickly. And what we're trying to do is get more conscious of that. So it's not that we slow it down, but that we start to ensure that we get better or more conscious of the content we're putting into this space, so that we get the better strategies. And we're doing it not only for ourselves, but also for teams as well. So pillar 1 as context. We're talking really about the physiological state or the mindset that shapes the content for futures thinking. We may have long-term goals and visions, but the immediate state determines what is relevant to consciousness in the moment. And this state is like a frame or lens that puts constraints on perceptions, values, attention, and anticipation. So one way to think about it is that we don't really imagine the world as it is, right? Or we really imagine the world from the state that we're in, right? And if we change our state, our image of the world starts to change as well. So here's kind of an example. It's this idea that you order a piece of pie at the beginning of dinner, and you evaluate the pleasure that you'll receive based on your current hunger state, right? And disregards the fact that at the end of the meal, you're going to be full, right? You don't think about that because you're thinking about this future where you're going to have this piece of pie because you're hungry right now. Now, eating the pie risks being far less rewarding than expected before, right? Because there's an asymmetry between the value of the pie when you make the choice and when you eat it, right? So really looking at how this state is shifting our value claims, right? When we're full and we eat the pie, that pie is not super valuable. But when we're hungry before dinner, that pie seems very valuable in the future. So correctly evaluating future events, an agent must stimulate future internal, like motivational and cognitive context, as well as the future external environment, right? The future outcomes. So this inner context really is having a huge impact on what futures we think about and how we think about the future. So let's just take a second here and think about, for yourself, what is the best state, maybe even mindset, do you feel like you have, you perform your best in? So let's just take a second, think about it. We'll just share that briefly. Does anybody want to start and share, just in general, where do you feel like that state, which state is it that really is helping you perform your best? Anybody have any insights on that?
I'm assuming we're talking individually, not in a group setting.
Okay. Yeah, you could talk about group too as well, but yeah, individually made is a good starting point.
I guess a relaxed state.
Okay.
Anyone
else? Yeah.
Able to focus.
Okay.
Able to get focused, right? Not distracted. Able to focus my mind. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I would say no. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Aurora.
Oh, for me, I think it's when I'm more coming from a curious state.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm not coming from feeling like I know, or that I'm an expert on something.
Great. Gabriel?
Yeah, mine would be a dynamic. So, taking that context and building on it. Similar to what Aurora said, curiosity kind of drives that dynamic mindset to try and find that innovation.
Adam?
I don't know which would be better, but either when I feel safe or inspired. So usually if there's some kind of fear, oftentimes when I'm pushing into something, but if I can just let my kind of chest and shoulders relax a bit and just do the work and accept, that's good. Or a kind of maybe slightly pressured pushing through, which sometimes those two modes sometimes compete. By sometimes I mean usually. So
now I'm gonna actually come off this PowerPoint here. How often do you think you're in these states that you want to be in? Oh, Ralph, we didn't get Ralph. I always forget Ralph.
I almost escaped. For me, it's a little bit, I don't know how to describe it. For me to be in a good state to get I have to have a goal. I mean, there is an end state that I've marked on the whiteboard. There's a dot. The better the state I'm in is more, the route is more flexible. I bring in the curiosity and rabbit holes and all that sort of thing. And if that's happening, I'm in a really happy mental state to get there. When I'm not, and I'm just goal orientated. You wanted X, that's what you're getting. There's nothing more coming out of me. There's no creativity. There's no well, what about? But it's just that framing. So as the more creative or the better mind state I'm in, the more flexible I am to explore avenues as I get to that goal. And I think that's, for me, is a great way to start. And I even limit, when I want to sit down to do stuff, I limit external newses and all a bunch of other things that could crank me up in the morning after my coffee of reading about whatever's going on in the government or whatever. I just avoid that stuff so I can stay flexible.
Okay. And then follow-up question, how often do you think you're in that state that you want to be in?
I'm actually through a lot of practice getting pretty good at it.
Good.
I mean, and I can tell when I'm walking down my commute of my hallway to my office, whether it's going to be just get the stuff done day, or I'm going to have some flexibility. And I because I'm basically my own boss, I sort my tasks based on my commute. If I'm walking down the hallway stomping my feet, and I just pull out tasks that are goal orientated, and I'll do those for a while till I feel better.
Anyone else want to share?
I feel like I'm a lot less there than I would want to be.
Okay.
Yeah. Significantly less than I would want to be. Yeah. And I think it's also because one of the things that I want to say before as to what is it that puts me in that state is I also need to feel connected to what it is that I'm doing, inspired. And I think for me, probably this is currently a bit the problem, that
Mm.
I'm doing something that I'm not that connected to anymore. And then it becomes quite difficult because it's easy to get distracted by other things, or go and do something else, or look at your phone on the same time, or anything else.
Mm.
So I think those two things probably work together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've noticed that sometimes it happens to you, sort of you realize you're in that state, but also that I feel sometimes I can actually, in a way, sort of turn it on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you feel like, okay, I'm distracted or I'm losing focus. So so for example, if I'm not able to really have a formal meditation time, I just sort of, sometimes I just close my eyes for a few minutes and just allow myself to do nothing, like not even trying to meditate or anything like that, just to be in that state of, as I said, just a state of not really seeking or achieving anything.
Great. Anyone else? Percentage of time you're in this state?
I'd go with somewhere around like 50 to 60% of my time,
Okay.
you know, because I think for me, it's important to balance it out. You know, like you want to balance out the time that you are thinking critically, dynamically, functionally, and then, like Aurora said, you want times where you're not thinking of anything.
Right.
That helps you rebalance so that you can go back to that dynamic mindset that allows you that innovation, that creativity. I think there needs to be a balance. Like I think that's a key aspect of these steady states and the whole mindset, really.
Tyler, sometimes because I've had the luxury of working for myself for so long, if I feel that I really need an optimal creative thinking mode, I will go do something that is enjoyable, relaxing, non-work related.
Mm-hmm.
And it tends to generate that mode so that then when I come and sit down and do the kind of focused intellectual work, I can usually bring that with me. So it sort of depends on what the task is needed,
Mm-hmm.
as to what mindset is really going to be best.
Me, I'd say it's I guess for the peace surrender state, maybe 10% of the time. For the inspired, which is also kind of a surrendered state, maybe 10% of the time. And then like shades of it where it's like kind of there, another like 10% for each of those, and then the rest of the time kind of a hot mess.
Great. Yeah, I think we were just kind of naturally already picking up on a lot of the overall themes of today in the module. We'll see that the main things you've picked for the optimal state are very relevant to the physiology. And what's interesting is that, but a lot of times leadership isn't operating in those states, just because of the context which the business environment is, or where they're forced to focus, or the type of people they have to deal with. And we want to look at, well, how can we, what is the optimal state? How can we sustain that, get into it, and what can we do with it? So let me share the screen again here. Okay. Okay. So, can you all see this image here?
Mm-hmm.
Looks pretty. I mean, to me, it looks very. It's very artistic, right? Very flowy. Can anybody have any guess what this could be?
Something inside the brain.
Okay. What else?
I see someone sitting in kind of a yoga pose.
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I would see it as like energy flow throughout a body or a system.
Okay.
It's not a linear path.
Yeah. Okay. So what this is my martial arts teacher. He attached lights to his body. He did a slow exposure camera, and he did martial arts forms. Okay. And what he wanted to see was what would happen if he put himself into different states and what kind of shapes would come out doing the same exact form. Now, this one was what he thought was one of the best forms. And it was a state of just feeling like joy and bliss and happiness, right? Really just trying to make that himself feel that way as he did the movement. But if he put himself into a state of anger or frustration, the form looked totally different through the light, right? Even though it was the same exact movement, it really wasn't, right? So kind of an interesting real world example of how our immediate state has this impact on, what kind of actions we take. In our martial arts training, our teacher would always remind us to be in a positive state. Even if you're in a fight, you should be in a happy, calm state. It's like, he would say you should be laughing that you're in a fight.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember that.
Yeah. And so because it's going to put your body in a very more relaxed, flowy kind of state so it can move better. And it doesn't seem to quite match the context. Typically we're supposed to be angry in a fight, maybe, right? But he said that's not really, if you want to get the best result, that's not the case. So we typically think about, as a leader too, we get a team together, we go through a process, we're going to get a result, and that's going to happen, right? You're going to get results. But what happens if we take a team and we get them into the right inner context? We shape the inner context in a very strategic way and then go through a process. What kind of results will we get?
And Tyler, just a question, maybe this is obvious, but just to be sure, when we talk about the inner context, we're talking about the peace of mind of this person or the state of mind of this individual, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I should have clarified that at the beginning. So by context, we can mean a few different things. We can actually look at it very granularly, like at the physiological level, which we're going to look a little bit at what that could look like. What's actually, what kind of hormones or what kind of brainwaves are going on in the body. We could also just have it from that kind of feeling state too, right? And like an emotional kind of state, or like we said, the mindset, like I'm feeling focused, right? Or calm. So it can have a few different meanings, but we're relating it specifically to the individual and realizing that it's coming from the inside. And we'll dive deeper into kind of what that looks like.
Okay.
But yeah, so mindset, physiology, all kind of, I think if you look at it scientifically, they all fit together. They're all really a reflection of each other. And so this inner context, right, is going to shape the content, which is then going to share with us the future possibilities, what's preventable, what's innovative, what the alternatives are. And kind of just to start off as like a real world example, worked with Rolls-Royce, developed a framework for them that really uses inner context a lot. And it's a simple tool that one of the simple tools we used was just like heartbeat focus. And we would integrate that throughout the process so that they would constantly go back to it to cultivate that inner state. And in the process, we kind of talked, at least initially, about, why do you want to do this inner context work? How the heartbeat focus works. And then when do you want to use it within the process, right? Because a lot of times in a process, you might, everybody starts getting really excited about something, but you could start to quickly move in the wrong direction, right? Even though it's exciting, it could be the wrong direction. So what do we do about that, right? Maybe we need to kind of recenter. We need a process to get back to this foundational context and then move forward again and see if that direction's still worthwhile or not. And what I found from this doing, just simple things like heartbeat focus, when the team goes through the process, they feel more calm and focused. They get new ideas. They feel more synchronized as a group. It's less competition in the group is what I've noticed too. Now there can be a feeling of a little bit of uncomfortableness because especially the person who's typically the senior or leader in the group, they are not physiologically in charge anymore. They're not the leader physiologically. It kind of starts to shift based on the state that people are in, who becomes the leader and how leadership emerges. So if they're used to talking a lot or everybody looking to them and getting ideas from them and feeding off of them, they're not going to feel as maybe respected or as connected to the group. And you have to be aware of that as well. And then as a result, some of the results I've seen, people have more aligned ideas, right? They feel more connected to the ideas they create. They're ready to take action after a facilitation process, for example. They don't say, let's go into another meeting. They say, let's go do it. Right. And they actually, I've actually had them come up to me and feel a little bit scared because they realize we're actually going to go do this thing and they want to wait. Right. Because typically they've had like another meeting about it or 6 months or a year before they implement. And they actually implement faster than before. So Rolls-Royce called me up and was like, we just implemented this, multi-million-dollar project. Usually would have taken us 3 years. We did it in 6 months, right? Because we felt like we were ready to do it and we felt aligned with the idea. So something different is happening maybe when we look at the inner context first. But also, so intuitively, this kind of makes sense, right? That the inner context is important. But just some ways to think about it. The brain and body are constantly exploring and strategizing and reacting to futures, like what we talked about. So we really want to look at how can we amplify this natural ability in positive ways to make future intelligent leaders. And, the evaluation process, which we talked about, is really influenced by the external factors. So the internal factors and the external factors. So a lot of times we tend to think about what's the external goal and how are we going to get driven towards that goal in some way. But we forget about the internal context that's also shaping that. Another interesting thing is that brain typically represents people as a sum of their mental states that they habitually experience. So what that means is that as a leader, one thing to think about is that as you're interacting with people or people are interacting with you, they don't always see you just as who you think you are. They see you as a state they're customarily seeing you in, right? So you might know a leader who's kind of always a little bit frustrated or fast, for example. And that becomes the dominant state that your brain represents that person as. And so that's what you expect. If we go back to that 3, 2, 1 in 3 seconds, right? Where the 3 neurons are firing and we have to make a decision about us versus them. And then we want to try to find this one common goal. Well, we're immediately putting, our brain is trying to speed up that process by already categorizing people into a certain state and saying, this is what we should expect from them. And if they don't align with that state, for example, he comes in one day and he's happy, that boss that's stressed and fast, and he comes in really happy and slow, you're going to immediately say there's a disconnect here. Something's wrong. He's not representing his current state. What's going on, right? Okay. So this inner context has a lot of external influence. The other thing is this ability to think about the future is uniquely human. Okay. Animals don't quite have the same relationship to state and futures like we do. But as we start to think about a future, we have to decouple from our current sense, right? Our current state that we're in. And we have to decouple from the current information that we're experiencing a lot of times, right? Especially when we're thinking about something long-term. So typically our brain is in the short term and it's getting fed information within the moment and trying to make decisions about the future in that moment based on the current context. And that's important for survival, right? Because we could be in a very dangerous or risky situation. And if we're sitting, outside daydreaming about a future because we're decoupled from the present and our current experience and we're imagining futures, we could get eaten by a lion, right? Okay. So, and again, just a reminder, right, that 3, 2, 1 in 3 seconds is really shaping a lot of how we see people, also how we see futures as well. And that's going to shape the content that's relevant and important for deciding the dominant goal frame. The other thing to consider is that there's a lot of short-termism as a dominant goal frame in leadership, right? Mm-hmm. There's a McKinsey study. It's 2013, but I still think it's relevant, the kind of thinking that's there. There's just a lot of pressures, right, on getting short-term results. And they say that's been increasing. A lot of pressure to, have financial performance over a period of 2 to 3 years, right? So we're starting to really constrict the timeframes in which we can think in. And there's a lot of pressure from boards, right, who are going to decide if we should get hired or fired. And so our long-term horizons, especially in the corporate space, are not that long-term, really. And so the idea is that when everything's going fine, we don't need foresight. We don't need to think about the future. And when things are not going fine, we don't have time to think about foresight, right? And so that starts to set a dominant state in our physiology. The future's not important. Why waste energy on it? People who think about the future are maybe reckless, right? Because they're wasting valuable time and energy that we should be focusing on the short term present, so we can get the financial results we need. So solution is, of course, is like this idea of interstate, but we need to figure out what, how do we change it? What is it? What's the optimal interstate? And, the idea is that we are, like, for example, if someone's going to move from a short-term mindset or thinking into more long-term, and they haven't done that, it is a big shift in their worldview. It's not like they just automatically think differently. It's not automatically that they can sustain this new state of foresight. They've built a lot of complexity and coherence around short-termism, let's say, right? Or whatever state they're in. And it really is kind of this transition process that has to happen from, not only in the moment, we might have this transition from one state to the other, but also as creating this more general state of being that we would have as an individual, right? That the brains can then start to recognize us as maybe a long-term thinking leader, right? And it takes time, because it takes time for our brain to shift and our physiology to shift, but also for people's perception of us as well to shift, right? So I could shift myself into a long-term thinker, but then other people might still be thinking I'm in that dominant short-term frame, and they're trying to, again, feed off me as the leader and provide me with that short-term information that I need, when I really have shifted into the more long-term thinking. Is that making sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to like this inner context, we typically start to think
Sorry,
about...
Tyler,
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
was
Hilda.
on mute there, but would you mind just to go back to the previous? I was just trying to understand the picture, how
Yeah,
best to interpret this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because it is kind of like it'd be a whole nother like topic
Right.
to talk about this. But the basic idea is that you're, is thinking of yourself as moving from, let's just think of like one state to another, is that you start to build on that left-hand side, right? You have this kind of state, and it has like rigid patterns or behaviors associated with it that really kind of anchor that dominant state. You could think of it as a culture in an organization, right? And it becomes more and more rigid. And so you have a lot of complexity that you then make more coherent over time as you make that one state, that one culture more rigid and more the dominant pattern.
Right. Yeah.
But then you lose over time, you start to lose creativity, innovation, adaptability. So then you might say, okay, I want to move into a new state, right? And so what you have to do is you have to decouple or create a disequilibrium with the old state, right? I mean, sorry, not a disequilibrium with the old state. You create a disequilibrium in yourself, basically, by decoupling. So now you've moved into this state where you're not feeling yourself anymore. And it takes time then to move into this new state. There's going to be a flux or a transition period. And then you can move into something new, right, over time. Is that making sense? And then you start to build you have more complexity maybe in that new state, or new types of complexity. And then you create more coherence around that complexity. So it becomes more normalized, more rigid, and then you do it again, right? Or you just stay there. That could be another way to think about it.
Yep. Thanks. And
this could be happening though in the moment, like when you're thinking of somebody they're sad one moment, then all of a sudden they're super happy, and that shift can seem very incoherent, right? And so the body has to move from like a coherence around sadness to a coherence around happiness. And so many things have to change, right? Not only the physiology in the body, like the hormones and chemicals, but also the external appearance and how you relate to people too has to change to really align all that. So one of the starting points of a, this idea of interstate might be around self-awareness, right? And a simple way to think about this hierarchy of self-awareness is we can have a very intellectual awareness of ourself, right? So maybe I'm aware of my past behaviors, how they have influenced me and what my past states have meant. I can even maybe intellectualize the current states I'm in some capacity. And that can allow for some adaptability If I'm feeling sad, and then I can kind of rationalize it in some way and kind of adapt in the moment. There's also kind of an emergence hierarchy where you're really present in the moment of how you're shifting, like how a state is shifting over time within the moment. And that can allow for more resilience, right? Because you might be able to notice a shift before, as it's happening, as opposed to as it's already happened. And then the final one would be more of a future anticipation, where you're actually pre-adapting, where you haven't even shifted into the state. You can notice that you're about to shift into it, and you can make adjustments to either a shift into it faster or shift away from it, right? So these are kind of the levels of, we'd say, like self-awareness that people might walk through, and people are going to be at different levels of this awareness, depending on the training they've had, right? So, for example, Hilde with the meditation, right? Can you relate to this hierarchy with that?
Sorry, with which meditation?
Yeah, when you do meditation, right? So you
Mhm.
said when you do meditation, then it's kind of like, if you do it, it's kind of like you're pre-adapting yourself to a certain state, right?
I think this was Aurora saying this,
Oh,
actually.
Aurora was saying it. Sorry,
Yeah.
Hilde. Sorry, Aurora was
No
saying
worries,
that.
no worries.
Yeah, for you, Aurora.
Yeah, no, I'm actually fascinated by this.
Yeah.
Yeah, although the type of meditation that I was talking about earlier tries actually kind of ironically not to anticipate anything.
Yes, right.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
But inadvertently, you are putting your brain into a state where
Yes.
it's open
Mm-hmm.
for something to emerge. So you're allowing actually for it to just be, and for any eventuality to happen.
Yep. Yeah. So you're kind of, I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess using the word anticipation can kind of make it a little tricky. But
Yes.
yeah, but by doing the meditation, you're kind of pre-adapting yourself to a certain state for something you might want, an outcome you might want, a way of thinking or being. The idea would be, for example, the intellectual awareness would be Aurora, feeling off, feeling bad, and thinking back, well, if I meditate, I could probably change my state, right? That's the intellectual kind of awareness of it. The present emergent kind of a resilience awareness would be like, wow, I'm not feeling good. I'm going to meditate right now, right? I feel that I'm off, and I can actually shift it, right? But the off state that I didn't want has already happened. And then the pre-adaptation was you kind of be preventative, right? Before the state you don't want, or moving yourself into the state you do want before it even happens. And again, these take practice to get there, but it's good to think about where you might be, or maybe your team might be too, in this as individuals, but also as a group, right? Are you doing things to be pre-adaptive, right? Or is your team more resilient, or is it more, it just has to adapt to whatever happens in the moment?
So Tyler, do you see these three levels sort of as, let's just say for the moment, we call them sort of strategies when you're applying this to the corporate space or for groups and teams?
Yeah.
And that people would define certain approaches or models or tactics in each of these areas that they might start to adopt.
I think that's a great way to think about
Okay.
it. And I like this because it's we're kind of framing it within the context of foresight or futures. I mean, ideally for the body, for a human body, it's like it's increases survival rate increases if you can anticipate the future accurately, right? You're constantly doing that moment to moment, second to second in your physiology by trying to maintain homeostasis at a very basic level. But then if you can expand that out further and now do this to a market level, then that's, the survival of your organization increases. But I think there's and I think that's important now. I think a lot of organizations got stuck in the adaptive phase where they got hit with a situation. They weren't necessarily resilient. They just had to make the best with what they were given. And they were in that past kind of intellectual state of awareness as an organization, and partly because they just, it was working. The past was working very well, but they hadn't done any work to cultivate the other levels. Some organizations out there, of course, were more in the resilience where they were in it, but they were able to adapt and actually improve upon the situation. They were able to kind of be aware of that emerging problems and challenges and adjust quickly. And then there were some that were ahead of the curve. They were already in that future. They had already pre-adapted, right? So you can look at this too as like, the pre-adaptation can be more like innovation. All right. The past intellectual would be more, just an adaptive space as well. You can think of it as adaptation. And I think most organizations would probably do well working in a resilience kind of space, the emergent, kind of really sensing the moment and being able to move quickly. But, this also looks at the size of an organization can have a huge impact on this too. That's why that bottom triangle part is big. I mean, you could think of that, the past intellectual phase. This would be an organization that is like a whale, right? Moving through the ocean. It's not easy for them to make changes. And the future anticipation could be more like a flock of, or a school of fish, right? Where they've done research and shown that fish kind of anticipate futures a little bit as a school, and they're able to move anticipatorily.
Tyler, just the comment kind of about a generic organization's position in the triangle.
Yeah.
In my experience with culture change for so long, is that many organizations, regardless of size, stay in the blue space because it's homeostasis, and they're continually adapting, often on a small scale, because that's the amount of change they can absorb. If they're going with a really significant change that's going to change the stability, they'll only do it if it's a survival issue, or if there's a real drive to increase revenue, or there's a real interest to move it out of a more homeostasis position and really head to the future. I will say that Amazon as a culture has trained their entire organization, especially their leadership group, to be constantly looking at the blue when they make changes. And I'm just reading a book about it written by 2 Amazon executives. But what I found fascinating is that they institutionalize the thinking that keeps that blue triangle at the top of every decision made within the department.
And
it's
that's
really
the bottom triangle or the top?
No, the top.
The top one. Okay, top one.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Which is
That's
unusual for organizations, right? So
Wow.
It's just fascinating just to say that I think for a lot of organizations, it's a little scary to promote that top of the triangle because it could basically destabilize the organization depending on what the degree of change is and how well they can absorb it. Yeah.
No, that's a great observation. Go ahead.
And I think I'd add to that is, that past intellectual, I mean, that's your cultural history of the organization, even yourself. That's how the external people see you. So that future anticipation little block in the top becomes very much shaped by that belief system about yourself. And to make that future anticipation thing really work, you used the term decouple there a while back, a couple slides back. You almost have to decouple that light blue, that past intellectual from that, break away with that tradition and set a completely new path. And that's extremely hard to get people to buy in. The larger the organization, the stronger the cultural history. And what's the old expression? Culture eats innovation for breakfast, or whatever. Whoever said that. I mean, it's so true.
Yes.
Yeah,
and it's also it's on a very basic level of the human body. It's the same kind of thing. If you're in that depressed state, it's not an optimal state, but it's your intellectual past, and you're just going to kind of stay there because you create a homeostasis around that. And then you might say, well, sure, I feel bad, and I can see a better future where I could be happy, but that's too much work, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for a lot of people, it's very hard to break that.
Yeah. It's scary, and it's also scary to get out of that because I'm very comfortable in this uncomfortableness, right? And I think a lot of organizations can get stuck there.
Mhm.
And so it's a hard, it takes a level of self-awareness first to recognize that this kind of maybe thinking in this kind of triangle. It takes a level of self-awareness to think in this terms.
Mhm.
Then it takes another level to actually take the action around
Right.
it, right? But it is interesting because they do show that, for example, self-aware teams have better team performance, right? So better decision qualities, better coordination, of course, better conflict management. So there is there's I'm sure if we dig more, there's research out there that shows like how self-awareness gets better results, right? Now that doesn't mean people want to do it still, right? Doesn't mean organizations want to reflect on that or individuals do, but it can get better results.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of things that are influencing this kind of state. We have hormones, the nervous system itself, our physiology, like if we slept, what we've ate, how much water we've had, and also just our general kind of understanding of our mindset. Are we stable, flexible, in the flow, calm? So again, like Hilde was asking about the context. It's like there's a lot of ways to think about context. We're going to try to actually simplify it today a little bit too, and try to get it to like a key thing. But we want to talk a little bit. We want to expand out a little bit and see what's in this idea of context. So, for example, in hormones, dopamine. There tends to be dopamine, serotonin, cortisol, oxytocin tend to be some big ones, especially in the leadership space. I'm sure Aurora, when you took in neuro leadership, they probably talk a lot about these in some sense.
Yeah, I think testosterone is not on there.
Okay, testosterone, that's a good one too. Dopamine is more that reward expectation. It actually motivates you to a pleasure in the future, right? So, and also it can be aware about awareness of avoiding pain in the future too, right? So it can be pleasure or pain is that dopamine signal. So for example, the example is that you find you're in a tribe and you find a new source of water, and you immediately get so excited because you're thinking about going back to the tribe and telling them about this new water, and not only how you get to drink it, but how they're going to be like, wow, congratulations, you found this, and reward you as well. Right. So then get that dopamine spike. Nowadays we get it from that like on our Facebook, right? Wow, I got the like. I feel good about myself. That's that reward. And I expect too, that might mean something like, wow, if I get 1-2 likes, maybe I get more. Maybe I should post more things. And that's that dopamine reward, really kind of cueing certain types of futures. The serotonin, interestingly, most of it's released in the intestines. A lot of it is. And the way to think of this is one of it's a respect hormone. So we actually get it from feeling respected, like for example, getting a diploma and walking down the aisle. But also it's a hormone of understanding how to balance the energy and reward, right? So, for example, if I get in a fight here, I might get that thing I want, but I've got to spend a lot of energy and I could die. So, do I really want to do that or not? And social hierarchies have been shown to influence serotonin levels. Typically, the leader in the group has higher serotonin levels in an organization. And then we have that feeling of, if you feel more superior, more confident than others, that could be a boost in serotonin. And then there also is this idea of avoiding conflict that serotonin is related to as well. So we might get a boost of serotonin when we avoid conflict as a reward, because it actually sustains us, keeps us alive, and actually sustains the hierarchy maybe within an organization or group too. Cortisol, this is a warning hormone that something internally or externally is dangerous. Right? There's some threat to survival. Typically, like for example, high levels of sugar in the body can also be related to high levels of cortisol. And it usually spikes associated with fear. And we get small drips of it associated with like low levels of stress or anxiety. And that can lead to, for example, disengagement over time. So cortisol is not a bad thing so much. I mean, we need cortisol, but it tends to get kind of a bad name because people have a lot of chronic, like low levels of cortisol in the body, which they don't need. And so they have chronic stress. And then oxytocin, this is like one way to think of it as a social trust hormone, a collaboration hormone. It really supports the herd too. So for example, although we think oxytocin is always like a good one. There are times where if it's somebody who's not part of the troop, part of the group, an outsider, oxytocin can kind of spike up and kind of trigger this really rejection of them too, right? So it typically really favors people in the us group, and it also kind of helps to alienate people in the them
Uh-huh.
group as well.
Mm.
But it typically associated with like touching, receiving touch, the connection between mothers and babies. And it's partly designed to help us like really support collaboration. So we share the burden of survival together in our tribe, right? And so, this is one level to start to look at things. We could look at a hormonal level.
Mhm.
We could look at physiological states as well. Typically, we think of a sympathetic and a parasympathetic state of the body. And people have probably heard of these before. I assume sympathetic would be more that fight or flight state. It mobilizes you to action in some
Mhm.
way, either to avoid
Yeah.
something or to go fight. And then parasympathetic is a more rest and digest and healing state. So less mobility, kind of a more of an immobile state. And there's you can think of like 5 physiological systems and states from this too. We tend to think of this mobilized fight or flight state, or that immobilized kind of state without fear, let's say, like an intimacy state. But there's also pro-social states, right? So where we are mobilized and engaged, right? And it's a good thing, right? It's not like we're in a fight or flight mode per se, right? We're moving and engaged. And also like a play state that can be similar to that pro-social state. We're mobilized and socializing. The pro-social state could also be an immobile state as well. That's why it's kind of differentiated from play. We could just be kind of relaxing and sitting there, but also be very pro-social, right? And then there can also be immobilized states with fear, right? So we can actually get, although parasympathetic state is like this rest and digest state, we could be kind of immobilized, just lethargic, but also maybe even or we could be in fear and immobilized, right? We tend to see this happen in a lot of animals. I don't know if you've seen an animal that like you spot them and then they just completely just freeze and they almost like
Mhm.
shut everything down, and they're just like,
Mhm.
I'm not here. Don't look at me. People can do that too as well, right? So this is a little diagram to kind of understand a little bit of the way that you can look at the states from the neurophysiological perspective. You can have the mobilized states with fight or flight, which is not what you want, of course. But then you can have mobilized where it's more pro-social, engaging, play, work. And typically these are going to be associated with more of a safe and trusting environments, right? Or you can have immobilized states where you have the freeze or avoidance, feeling threatened or feared, or immobilized where you have more like discernment, reflection, intimacy, right? And, it's not always true, but typically when we're in the more threat or fear state, we go into short-termism, right? And
Sure.
when we're in the more safe and trusting, we move into a more long-term kind of perspective, right? We can actually think about the long term. And another way to think about this, I don't know if has everybody seen or heard of these modes, the default network mode or executive mode or Salient network?
Mm.
No.
Yeah, I've heard of these.
Aurora has. Okay. Yeah, so this is not as common, although it is growing. There's a lot of great research out there. And so what this model is looking at is that it's kind of tried to kind of group these different, like let's say the neurophysiological states into a more focus on either self-referencing or external kind of referencing, right? This inner or the outer world is kind of a very simple, basic way to look at it. The default network is this network of like self-referential. When you're looking at your own autobiography, your personal values, your self-awareness, past behaviors, imagination. So the idea is that when you're doing those things, this network in the brain lights up, right? And there's a lot of research that's showing how these networks are connected. And then when you shift into a more, let's say, external focused, where you're thinking about the environment more, or thinking about a task, or even thinking more rationally, we tend to activate the executive network of the brain. Okay. So it's like these kind of big groupings of activity in the brain, defaulted to these or kind of through these two networks, right? And it is important. It's kind of like the idea that we're switching between them. I think in the work environment, this works a little bit better than looking at the parasympathetic versus sympathetic, because we typically tend to be either like on task and focused on something outside, or focused inside. That's the default network. I would say a lot of times we're maybe more in the executive network than the default network, but we need both, and they're both important. The salience network is kind of the switch between the two. Okay. So, and that's going to be, that is a lot of it is that kind of external and internal awareness. What's going on around me that should determine which mode and network is best right now. Right. So for example, if I'm in the executive network and I'm kind of, my brain is firing and I'm focusing on a task, but the salience network is kind of sensing and says, okay, wait, I think I need to go to the bathroom. Okay. I need to take a break from this on task, maybe move into a new task. That could be it. Right. Or I'm not feeling well right now. All right. I need to take a break. So let's move into the default network. Let's kind of disconnect from this work, focus on work. Maybe be a little more self-reflective. It tends to be that like imagination, creativity tends to be in the default network is when we're activating that one. So that's important because if you're in a meeting and the meeting is designed to constantly activate the more executive network and be on task, you don't get to access more of the imagination, creativity, which could be associated with foresight, right? So in the process of a facilitation as a leader, when you're really trying to organize teams, is being able to recognize which network we need to be in, how to shift between those networks as well, so that we can be on task when we need to be and be more reflective when we need to be, right? The reflective part's going to create more of the alignment, the coherence, the imagination, creativity. And I think more of that kind of inner work that we're talking about right now. Does this make sense on this? Or do you have anything to add? Because you've done some look at this as well.
Yeah, it's just really that they discovered this default network lighting up when people are, that they're lying in fMRI machines were being tested for a task. And so if for example, if people are looking at their brain and they're doing a particular task, they're looking for what's lighting up. And then when they say, okay, take a break, the default network fires up because that's pretty much the sort of the default state. And what they've noticed is it's the same network that lights up when we're thinking about our social relationships and kind of our perception of our status and standing among our peers. And so it's quite fascinating.
Yeah. I think this is it can be a pretty useful model. Just as a simple, like, am I in default or am I in executive? Which one is most relevant to this? What I'm doing right now. I think they had an interesting study on rappers. I don't know if you saw that, Aurora, but they wanted to see which network they were in, right? When they were rapping, where they kind of focus more on that kind of on task, and I'm like, and that's driving it, or am I more in the default? And they found they're more in the default mode when they're freestyle rapping, right? So they're just kind of making things up on the moment. Now, if it's something they've memorized, maybe it goes more into the executive. I don't remember the distinction there, but when it's more in that creative space and that flow space, they're activating default, right? So a lot of this self-referencing, that's actually inspiring that creativity for the external.
Excellent.
Yeah. And the thing is how do we shift, right? How do we shift consistently into the right context, the right network? And so that's what we're going to look a little bit at, like, what's the right context that we want to be in to shift that? So how do we stimulate the salience network to shift between default and executive? And knowing and realizing that probably more often than not, we're in the executive mode, especially at work, right? And we need to maybe put more attention on how do we shift to the default network, especially when it's important. And I think all this is relevant. Just a few kind of study or information that kind of backs it up is the science of teams from the military of over 60 years of research. They said teams that are more cohesive, feel more connected, they perform better, they stay together longer, and they have less errors, right? They have able to deal with challenges better. Okay. So something here about this cohesion this coherence part. That's important. Team cognitive process plays a significant role in team performance. So what they think and how they think and how well they think together is important as well. That's going to shape their perceptions and beliefs and contribute to their ability to perform. So there's something here about thinking, like the right type of thinking, that's important. And also research from Google, right? They found 5 key dynamics for team success. I think the first one's the most important and relevant to this conversation is the idea of psychological safety, which someone had mentioned earlier as one of the things that's important for feeling like you're going to be your best in the moment. So that psychological safety allows us to take risks. We don't feel as insecure or embarrassed if we fail, right? So how do we feel safe to fail is important. Okay. So based on that, this kind of some of this research and what we talked about the body and brain, what's the optimal state for leadership and foresight? And again, kind of playing off this idea, right? We're trying to shape the inner context. We know from the research, we need something that has cohesion or high coherence. We need something that really stimulates different levels of cognitive thinking and provides psychological safety. And that makes sense because in a complex environment, one of the big things that tends to happen is we look for coherence, right? We try to find what patterns are coherent with each other. And this allows us not only to deal with the complexity of the environment, but also to increase our ability to think in complexity. Uncertainty requires trust, right? Because we can't predict the outcomes of our decision. And with rapid change, we require physical and mental resilience, right? When things don't go as planned, how are we going to bounce back properly? So I was at the Science of Consciousness conference where I met Adam again quite a few years back. And there was a really interesting talk where they looked at this idea of consciousness. And so when I use the word consciousness, I want to be clear that I'm using it more from a kind of scientific perspective, not like a mystical kind of perspective. But how do we measure consciousness, right? And at the low levels of consciousness, we're looking at like when people are sleeping, when they're on opioids, or when they've had anesthesia, right? And they're just not coherent of the outer world or the inner world as much, right? They've kind of lost consciousness in a real way. And then on the high levels of consciousness, when researchers studying that, they're looking at meditation and mindfulness practitioners, also people who are on psychoactive drugs, right? And seeing what's going on in the brain at these higher states of consciousness. One of the things you'll notice, it's not on the bottom here, but at the top here, as you move into like higher states of consciousness, you can move into unconsciousness, right? As you get higher and higher states, it could happen that you become unconscious. And same with lower states as well. I don't have this at the bottom, but as you move to lower and lower states, you become unconscious as well. And we try to operate really within this, average or normal level of consciousness to operate in the environment. We don't typically try to go to these higher or lower states unless it's the right context for that, right? But what they found out at higher states of consciousness, let me zoom in here. We can look at this. Some things that we see happening in the brain specifically. We actually have more entropy in the brain. We have more connectivity happening in the brain. All right. So what's interesting about that is we actually have over here, you'll see we have not only short-term connectivity, but also long-term connectivity. One of the things they've seen in the brain is they have like a global coherence where there's parts of the brain that don't even seem like they're connected that start to fire and light up together. We have more power, energy running through the brain. But most interesting, I think, to me, is that we have a more complex, more uncertain, and more rapidly changing brain when we're in higher states, right? So what that kind of tells me is that at higher states of consciousness, we're going to find more uncertainty, complexity, exponential change. And that is the kind of reality of leadership we're kind of operating in now as well. So it tends to say, well, maybe leaders need to move into higher states of consciousness in some way and get comfortable there so they can deal with uncertainty, complexity, and rapid change. Adam, do you have anything you want to add to that? Because I know this is your expertise space.
It that all sounds right to me. There seems to be this zone between order and disorder, where you can be in excessive in either direction. And it seems to be physicists will sometimes call this zone the edge of chaos. And there seems to be like a general principle across all interesting systems, including the brain, of any system that can be interesting, intelligent, adaptive, of self-organized criticality. So the idea is a system that moves itself and keeps bringing itself back to this edge of chaos, not necessarily falling in, but and it's kind of understood as this inter-regime. If you're like between regimes, you're at the edge of the phase transition. And so like there's all these different, and it gets you a couple of things. It gets you access to more areas of state space because you're at the border, so you can go one way or another way. But also when you're at this place, and it's kind of in that earlier slide where you're talking about like this moving in and out, like this cycle across time of like getting trapped by your own mastery, and then like you become rigid, and then you have to dissolve it, and then like a new regime has to form. And so there's just like moving in and out of chaos that like has to be navigated. But like all interesting systems, seems like they have to have this dual phase evolution. And what's interesting about this, and so think about this critical regime of like the near critical regime, that the edge of chaos is, it lets you do this. It's the place you want to be for growth and moving in and out. And it's also, I guess, another principle that's related to it is it's like it's, if you think of like the evolutionary process and natural selection, you know, the basic formula of any system to make an evolving system is you need to have replication or persistence, variation, and selection. And so you need to have this like diversity to select from, and then you then select particular diverse forms and make them more likely, and you keep going with it. But for this to even like work, you have to you got to be critical. You have to be near critical, because you want to have enough richness and diversity, enough disorder to generate the novelty. But you don't want so much that you can't get complexity building upon complexity. So like this moving back and forth in and out of critical regimes, like or in and out of these like near chaotic regimes, and like more entropy, less entropy, like any complex adaptive system on any scale has to do this, including the brain.
So yeah, that's interesting. So it's like this average level of consciousness is, you're basically saying you want to expand that so that you're able to change your point of criticality either higher or even at the lower levels too, right? Where you can and still keep functioning, but then also you access, by expanding that, you access more states, more repertoire of states, so you can in one sense be more resilient too. Is that correct?
Yeah. And actually, you're making me think of like another thing about criticality is it's been shown to have like, it's been associated like in like a physical system, you get optimal like physical flows of like there's connections to like superconductivity, and there's like connections to like fluid dynamics, and actually like the conditions where it's like being able like the fluid to move around certain things, like when you're at this like balance point, it works out with it works there, but also it's been associated with criticality has been associated with optimal communication. So it's also like you have maximum information transitions between systems. So it's like if you have one critical system and another, they're maximally pivotable, adaptable, and they can exchange information most efficiently. So if you're having like, if you're trying to get coherence in terms of like meaningful communication across a group of people, if they
need to be at the edge of their level,
useful. Right? The one wrinkle that's kind of interesting though is something else that the complex systems will do though, is they'll sometimes do a kind of divide and conquer, like a division of labor with gains from trade, where like you'll have some systems that are like subcritical, some systems which are like tend towards like more near critical, and then across them you can have like stability where you want it. So it's like you might like, for instance, yeah, and so like you might want like a more like a shamanistic leader in some cases, or maybe the leader should actually be like the rock,
right?
Like that would depend, I guess, on like what regime the system needs to be in. Yeah.
So it's like the state of conscious is going to be important for the leader to understand which state to bring to the environment, right? It's not like that we want to constantly be at a higher state of conscious all the time, but I think the most important thing would be that we want to be able to access as needed, right? So
Interesting thing though is it seems like this could even though be potentially both part of what enables consciousness, because consciousness requires high degrees of coherence
Yep.
to be at this like balancement, but also one of the functions of consciousness is as like a self-tuning mechanism where it's like the system evaluating itself, how are you doing, and then like basically am I where I ought to be, and so like you're like as usual like way ahead of the curve on everything, and that like your emphasis on like heart rate variability or for instance that's like a hallmark of criticality, and so but that's also like a kind of like basic integrator of value. It's like or the gut, like these basic life managements, like when they're working right, they're showing this like dynamic balance, this dance, which actually I've seen in you like since I saw you in the gym, like that's what you were doing in the gym. And so consciousness potentially, part of it, one of its functions would be to help you to place yourself in that zone where you can have that near
Right
optimal.
place.
Well, yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. So, what I would boil this all down to is coherence, right? Is this idea of coherence. And with the idea of coherence is basically that things are working more in harmony. There's more connectivity between things, not only locally, but could be globally. And we can think of coherence in the form of like speech, for example. If what I'm thinking and what I'm saying actually aligns with what the other person is understanding and thinking, we have high coherence there, right? And when things aren't coherent, we have a lot of disconnect, confusion. And typically when we move our brain into coherent states, we have a decrease in the amygdala activity, which can be the kind of that fear center in some way, or that kind of reversion back to primitive behaviors. And like we said in the image, we had more power and energy. And I also like to think of coherence as kind of a pre-flow state. So if people want to move into a really high performance state, coherence could be the kind of idling baseline state to start from. So, what could this idea of coherence look like? Well, first from leadership, there was a study, I don't know if you've seen, that was done, and they talked about it in Harvard Business Review. And what they found out is they wanted to find out what would happen if they had a leaderless group. Would a leader emerge naturally or not? And they took 3 people, they hooked up EEGs to their brain, and kind of monitored what was going on. And it says right here that researchers could predict in about 23 seconds, just by looking at the data on the EEGs, who was the leader in the room, right? And what they found out is that the leader in the room was the one who actually created more synchrony, more coherence between their brain waves and the brain waves of others. Okay, so it's a real on the brain level, on the physiological level. One way to think about leadership is it's this idea of coherence. Someone can enter a room and not have the title, but if they create more coherence between their brain and the brains of others, they become the leader, right? Even if they don't have the title. Physiologically, neurophysiologically, they're the leader in the room. Their brain recognizes that. And what was interesting too is that in the study, it wasn't just that they could see it in the brain waves. Observers could also, as they watched the group interact, they intuitively knew who the leader was as well. Even though there wasn't like a title or a clear sign, they could pick the person out. So we can actually observe this happening, this kind of neurophysiology happening at the gross level. So what is like brain coherence? Well, typically we think of kind of a synchronistic brain patterns. Typically then we think of the brain being more coherent when it's in alpha waves, which is there's different brainwave patterns, and beta waves tend to be really more faster waves. As we move into an alpha, this becomes a little bit of a slower kind of meditative maybe type wave. If you're just sitting here and if you just close your eyes for a second right now and just notice how your brain shifts in that first few seconds, typically you'll see it'll have an increase in alpha waves, right? Just from shutting the eyes. And it could, as you start to think after that, it could move and shift out of that alpha wave, but typically you have that. So it's kind of that initial like relaxing kind of state.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when people have more alpha brain waves, they tend to have higher cognitive function, increased bodily control, more creativity, more connectivity. So a lot of good things start to happen in this state. Now, there's some things you can do actually to also just kind of create coherence within the brain itself. For example, if you want to create more coherence between your left and right hemisphere, you can do things like doodling, right? If you notice, there's some people who in a meeting, they might be talking to you and they might be taking notes or just doodling, like just little doodles, not meaningless. It actually is integrating left and right side of their brains. They're getting more whole brain activity. You can also cross your body, like just crossing your legs actually can start to engage both hemispheres a little more. You can also look at integrating like the limbic system and the frontal cortex. So that limbic system is kind of the old system of the brain, and that frontal cortex is more that rational part of the brain. And you can do this again through like self-reflection activities, in self-reflective practices. Meditation could help as well. You can also look at integrating memories and meaning, right? So you have a memory of the past, but what does that actually mean to you now, right? And making sure that they're coherent and aligned. So we do that through like storytelling or narratives. And the other thing you can do is you can look at integrating your senses and imagination, right? So what you're sensing in the moment, is it related to what you're imagining? You can actually utilize this for foresight as a tool to go into a future and sense, like really start to activate the feelings of a certain future and really integrate that with your imagination. And that makes your brain really coherent with that future. But when it comes to the brain, at least I'm sure Adam will agree with this too, is it's very complex, and there's stuff that's, how we think things work. Then there's pieces that don't quite work the same way we think they do. And there's so many moving pieces in there. Yeah.
I mean, well, I don't know. Again, you kind of nailed it. Like, I actually don't know how you do what you do. For me, like, and it's like these like super technical computational models of consciousness I've been developing, like the default like refresh rate of the conscious field of like your basic phenomenal consciousness is at alpha, because there seems to be this like inverse relationship of these frequency bands, which one of their functional significance is I think Pascal Fries calls it communication through coherence. So for the neurons to actually have like, neurons are noisy. It's like there's all sorts of like, if you zoom in on the neurons, it's not like you get really close. It's not just like this like dance of electricity that's neat. It's like
chaos,
this maelstrom. Yeah. And so the only way that anything gets through is for things to like form these little coalitions, these ensembles that can be aligned. And otherwise the signals will just decay if they don't get into the right window. And so like when you bring them together and like into synchrony, into this entrainment relationship, well, then you can get this communication and these coherent flows of meaning and inference. And so these frequency bands, part of the functional significance is thought of, they're allowing for basically different zones of integration among these different neurons of different points of view to get this sort of synergy across them. And so in terms of like the ability of like things to sync themselves up, there's this interesting thing of there seems to be an inverse relationship between the speed of the sync and the size of the zone. So it's like, it's easy to take like a small system and get into sync because it doesn't take much communication, but a really big system, it will take more. And it's both like the signals have to travel further and there's more things to come into agreement. And alpha seems to, so it's like beta would be really, you could have like high beta, which would be like a small synchronous complex, like one that's like a little part of the brain, but it's like a local belief of like, something in your visual field. It's like it could be completely unconscious. And you might have like a slightly like broader like set of neurons saying, okay, I think this is what's going on. But once you get to alpha, that's where you're bringing together basically the kinds of information you would need to model your entire body and its relationships to the world. So that's the part where you would get all the sensorium together, sight, sound, touch,
Mhm.
and interoception. That's at the sweet spot where you have enough information pegged to you. And so it seems like this is the default refresh rate of consciousness. And I didn't know actually that it correlated with heart rate coherence until like I was looking at your materials, and
Yeah.
that's
Hmm.
amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's the part, is like the idea is like the brain. When I looked at the
Yeah.
brain and like trying to figure out like what is this state, it's like it gets really complex really fast. And I said, well, what's another option, right? How can we
Mhm.
simplify this?
Right.
And so that's where this is a sheet here I'll send with you. It kind of talks about brain integration. I'll send you a copy of just kind of what this looks like. But more importantly is this idea of heart coherence, because it tends to just really simplify everything into a simpler place in a sense. So heart coherence is actually observed through HRV, which is heart rate variability. And what the heart rate variability is that as we are inhaling and exhaling, right, our heart rate is speeding up and slowing down. And although we measure like beats per minute, even within our beats per minute, there's variation, right? The gap between the beats is going to be shorter or longer as we're inhaling and exhaling within that time frame as well. And this variability is looking at what's the length of variability? Like as we inhale and the heart rate is speeding up, how close are these heart rates getting? Are these heartbeats getting? And as we exhale and this heart rate slows down, how wide is that space between them? And is there a lot of variability there or not? If there's not a lot of variability, like if it looks like a metronome, that's not good. That's kind of like, okay, there's something wrong with this person. We want variability in this. We want the heart to have this resilience in this wide zone of heartbeat timing. Okay, does that make sense for everybody? And it's interesting because this HRV is it's well studied by a group called HeartMath in California. Done a lot of research around it. It's well used by athletes. It's becoming one of the dominant sources of information for athletics to decide if they're in the optimal state for working out, for training, and for performing or not. It really helps to understand the relationship between the sympathetic and parasympathetic system and how the balance is in the body, right? And so one way to think about it, if we have a good HRV, it's a great day to be on task. It's a great day to work out. If we have low HRV, we don't have a healthier HRV, maybe get into that default mode more, right? Get into some more self-reflection, relax, take it easy, okay? And what we see when we have healthy HRV, we see heart-brain synchrony. We see actually communication between the heart and brain. We see an increase in cognitive function, increase in creativity, increase in decision-making, increase in emotional control, decrease in stress. Typically, we'll see an increase in alpha waves in the brain itself as well. So the heart tends to be this really interesting place because one is a lot of people aren't looking at the heart. We're looking at the brain more. But intuitively, we've always kind of talked about the heart as being something really, really important. I always like to remind people, like in Chinese medical theory, the heart is given the role as the emperor. The brain is not given any job at all. Okay. That's interesting to me. I don't know why the Chinese thought about that way, but it says the heart should be in charge, right? And if we look at the heart, it is actually communicating to the body in several ways. One through the heartbeat, that rhythm. One through the blood flow and the rhythm of the blood flow. It's also sending hormones out, electrical signals out to the brain, to the body. Another one that's not as common, although it's been studied by HeartMath, is there is an electromagnetic field of the heart, right? It's not very strong. It takes certain special equipment to measure it, but they can measure it like 4 to 5 feet outside the body. So, and another thing that is related to this, although it's not specifically to the heart, is the volatilomes, which I don't know if you're familiar with volatilomes, but there's this idea that there is this kind of release of chemicals and hormones that can be sensed outside the body as well, and other people can sense that. So it's giving more credence to the idea that when we're in the room, we're not just in our own space. We're in everybody's space. We're in their physiology. we're in their heartbeat,
Right.
we're in their hormones. And as a leader, you want to understand that, because that's going to have a huge impact on how you're received as a leader, how you inspire others or don't, and also what types of futures can be thought about. Yeah, of course, Adam.
Some man, I think this is like an example of like where like science kind of like lost the plot and kind of went off the rails, and that like it if the heart's not working, you get like some, what was it, like 2 billion beats or something? I forget what it is, but it's like if it's not working, you're done. And so like
Right.
obviously like the
Right.
core of value
Mhm.
and the core of, and also just the sensitivity to your emotional states, like if it's accelerating, if it's like this is like giving you a read on what kind of situation you're in, it's like it's always associated with like emotions as putting you into these different kinds of like goal oriented and survival modes. And
Mm-hmm.
so like the source of like richness of the information, it's like how I don't know how you could overstate it. Interesting thing in terms of like the connection you're talking about. Um, that probably starts like prenatally, like in the relationship between the fetus and the mother, like in terms of sound, it's the
Heartbeat.
dominant source of sound is like the mother's
Yes.
heart.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
You can get like, and the fetus is like right on top of it too. And so like
Mhm.
from this like chaos, it's like the infant's brain is like wiring itself up from the beginning. Heart synchrony is part of this story.
Mhm.
I don't know how much of it would be via the electric field, but
Right.
part of it could be via the auditory path. It could be both.
Yep.
But this then could give you like a basis for like, you can then use this as a basis for contributing to like the sense of shared emotion, in a way, even prenatally. But then as you
Yep.
get out into the world, you're like, for instance, like the fetus can smell its mother. It shares like a lot of hormones. So like, you know, if some like opioids can potentially cross, or like some cortisol can cross, and this is all in line with the heart. And so you have like this reference point. And one more cool thing about the heart is I saw this talk recently, and I had no idea about this. Apparently, we can better than chance detect someone else's heartbeat because we can actually see the flushing in the face.
Oh
Like
wow.
we're somehow unconsciously.
Subconsciously.
Picking it
Wow.
up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the heart. If you you know, and if you dive into the heart, like there's so much I could talk about with the heart, because it is, it's kind of magical in many ways. I mean, they've done
Yeah.
research to show that the heart will change in anticipation of a choice before you know you're going to make the choice. So like they've done studies where they've actually shown people cards, images of things that are kind of negative or positive. And, you know, I don't know how, you know, I don't know if this has been repeated or not, though, the study, but there was definitely evidence to show that the heart will actually make a shift in the physiology. It actually knows what card's going to be flipped over before you do, in some
Before
sense.
consciously.
Now, it could be because of the other person looking at it, right? So it could be an empathic type of thing that's going on. The heart actually will. There's a group in Kansas called Hansa Medical Center. They're actually doing research where they're looking at people's heart rate or heartbeats, and they're finding people who are sick, you know, ill, and looking at their heart, and then taking the heart and putting it into musical software and spacing it properly. So the heartbeat now is more, it has a more dynamic HRV. And then they're recording that and having the person listen to it over a period of time. So by listening to their heartbeat over time, their heart starts to synchronize with that. And they've shown positive health outcomes just from that alone. So there's something really powerful about the heart. And I think with leadership, it could be kind of a secret sauce in a sense, and also with foresight, because it's going to put you into the space where you feel calm, relaxed. You're getting that brain heart connectivity, but you're also putting your brain in the right state to think about the future. And a lot of times we're kind of approaching leadership and even foresight from a very cognitive space. But we might be missing a lot of this idea of coherence, right? We might be really smart, but lacking the coherence that's necessary. And so a simple tool that I've used to help people in foresight, or even just for myself, is just focusing on your heartbeat, which seems so like rudimentary, right? I'm just going to feel my heartbeat, but you can just feel it. So if everybody let's take a second and just do that. And you can feel it like in your neck as one place, or in the thumb side of your wrist or just on your chest, right? Or you can just feel it kind of if you're aware of it, you can feel it just beating. And all you do is you put your attention there. It's not a meditation so much as just, you just become aware of the beat of your heart. Let's do this for about a minute and then we'll stop. Okay, we can stop there. I don't know if you notice how it feels differently a little bit for you after doing that. Does anyone have anything, given that was only just a minute?
Well, what I do occasionally is I have a watch that does a pulse rate,
Yeah,
and I'll pop it up, and then I'll just concentrate on making the number go down.
that's
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
And it really does. I mean, you
Yeah.
can sort of control it.
That's great.
So I mean, that's an easy way just to distract yourself and refocus, and give you a chance to refocus on what you're doing.
Yep. Anybody else have any thing they noticed after doing that different?
I don't know if it was different. Just, I think, focusing on the heart. It just makes everything very quiet. It just, my brain didn't think about anything else but my heartbeat. So for that moment, that's all I thought about. And even that wasn't thinking, that was just noticing. Right. So is that part of the purpose?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
What's interesting too is when you have a group of people do that in a room together. Like I've done sessions and someone would pop in and they would just kind of like, well, what's going on in here? Almost like, is this a meditation class? And I'm like, no, we're doing foresight work. And they're like, oh, okay. Because it's so calm. It's almost like and people aren't as comfortable there in the work environment too. You know, they feel a little bit, at first they can feel a little bit like out of place, right? Because the pace is slower. But then they realize, wow, I feel better. I feel more connected. Some people say that, like, I feel like all of a sudden I feel like everybody in this room is like part of my family or something strange like that. Or they'll get new ideas from it. They'll definitely be more like attentive to others in that process too. Just from that. Aurora, you had something to share?
Yeah, I just noticed that I actually do. I play competitive tennis, and for those of you who know, the serve is very anxiety striking, right? Like you have to be so calm to serve at tennis, and I actually do have anxiety sometimes, and I just now realize that that's what I do to calm myself down.
You do that.
There's nothing else I could do at that moment but to sort of focus on something that's connected to my body, so I can connect to the body. And it works. Yeah. It works.
Yeah, I find this to be a really simple tool. Then they've done studies just by focusing on the heartbeat. You do start to get more healthier HRV, more alpha brain waves. You start to have all these positive effects. And I've seen it in facilitations. You definitely have a more group coherence too. You definitely have a level of connectivity that you can just sense it's different, than before. And one of the, like a real simple, like physical explanation for why this works is that in the moment, the brain is looking for three things, like constantly. You have to be breathing, your heart has to be beating, your blood pressure has to be okay. If any one of these three things is off, it's
Mhm.
kind of like a no-go for anything else in life. Like you'll
Got
pass
it.
out, you'll faint. So by focusing on the heartbeat, you're already satisfying two of those. Like your heart's beating. Okay, cool. Check.
Mhm.
Your blood pressure, well, it's kind of like you're sensing something that related to that. So that's okay. And then your breathing starts to shift, right? In a sense as well from that. So you're really
Mm.
satisfying this core basic survival need
Mm.
of the body. And then from that, it can then orientate to stimulus better, right? It's
Mhm.
not in like a
Mhm.
stressed or scary mode. So that 3-2-1 in 3 seconds
Right.
we talked about, it has a different, you have now have a different impact from there.
Mhm.
We can assess risk differently, right? We're actually in a more pro-social state as opposed to a defensive state, right?
Mhm.
So imagine going into a meeting with your boss about something that wasn't comfortable. You're going to be in a defensive state. But if you both focus on your heartbeat for 3 minutes beforehand, that's neutralized, right? You can now shift into something different. I wish Armand was here. He's the military guy that's on the advisory team, and he uses heartbeat variability, heartbeat focus with his team. He commands the military base in Honolulu, and with his sailors, he uses HRV. And what he's
Mhm.
found is it basically really allows them to get better in sync, and it clears away all the surface kind of mental garbage that's there of like why
Sure.
something's happening. Because typically he said in the past he would have a meeting with his corpsmen, and they would kind of like, I'm having problems at work with so and so, and this is the reason why, and they're not following protocol or whatever. And then once they do the heartbeat focus, it's more like, yeah, my marriage isn't very good. They start to get really at the core.
Mm.
So it tends to be some type of connectivity happens in the brain where you can't kind of hide what's really going on, but also I think
Mm.
you can't hide what futures you really want to start to bring forth. Yeah, Adam.
Um, Actually, yeah, there's multiple, I think, deep connections between consciousness and the heart. Because part of it, like when the left ventricle contracts, this seems to cause like this phase resetting, and tends to like peg all the rhythms.
Mm.
And there's a sense where like there's this nested hierarchy where like the slower rhythms help to bring coherence to the faster rhythms, and then there's faster ones within that. And so like these are all kind of within this like overall envelope of the heart. But the thing that's coming to mind for me is with what you just said is like I'm like completely convinced like having like this closer connection to my heart would be of value. And like and when I do like a meditation of like on the pulse, like I did it more after we started talking, it does so many good things. But I think actually sometimes like I'm avoiding it because I want to look away from my experience, and I'm like trying to hide something from myself or like not be accountable. I'm like trying to like avoid integrity in a certain kind of way. Like I don't want the coherence. I don't want to notice. And as if I'm going to get away with it somehow.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, it's interesting in sessions when I'm doing the work, I'm keeping an eye on people who don't want to participate in this, right? Because it's going to give me a big sign that they don't want to create more coherence with themselves for some reason. That's interesting one, but obviously they don't want to create as much coherence with the group either. So I know, like in my mind, the way I think about it, for example, if let's say you get a group of world leaders together, or even a group of Republicans and Democrats together to discuss politics in America, what should go forward. If they're not willing to sit down and listen to their heartbeats for like 3 minutes together, it's just then nothing's good gonna come out of this scenario. Because they're just rejecting the ability or rejecting that initial context that really we need to create. So even in business environment, I'm looking for that as well. And I do see it, I'll find those people who don't want to quite connect. And when that happens, I have to then kind of look for new ways to get them to create that coherence so that we get the better outcome, or else they're going to be really disruptive in the group, right? They're going to constantly try to pull the group out of a state of coherence. So let me just kind of wrap up here. Oh, go ahead.
One more quick thing.
Yeah.
I actually wonder, like, so like you apparently, this probably is part of your secret sauce, is like you've developed this heart rate awareness. Like you can just do it. I really want that because I feel like it would in some ways, so both like, like I have to listen. I can't fully control it. I think it puts me in a more balanced state, but there's a sense where like, if the heart rate, I couldn't quite escape it, maybe like make me a little bit less of a scoundrel. And like, I would be like it's just like, yep, there's that information. That's what's going on.
Mm.
And like, I don't know, like how long does it take to like scaffold like hands-free mode?
Yeah.
That just like it's
It
gonna
does.
show up.
It does take, I mean, so for me, it is an interesting process because, I went to medical school. I learned how to listen to heartbeats through stethoscopes, but it wasn't, but really first time really listening to my heartbeat was, I was on a vision quest in Arizona out in the desert. I woke up in the middle of the night at like 3 a.m. because there was this loud rhythmic sound that I heard. It was my heartbeat and it freaked me out. And I was like, wow, I've never heard my heartbeat this way before.
Wow.
Because everything was just so quiet in the desert and calm. I think my mind was calm. And then in my martial arts training, we learned that you first learn how to feel your heartbeat, and then you learn how to beat your heartbeat into your sword so that it becomes one with you, right? So you have to have this practice where you can actually feel the rhythm of your heartbeat in the sword as you're moving. Because then you have this high level of coherence with that. It won't cut you. That's the main reason why, because you've actually made it one with your physiology at that point, one with your movement. So I think there's that same kind of level as a leader. If you're willing, I guess the way I like to think about it as a leader, if you're willing to really listen to your own heartbeat and engage that, and make that, kind of a core, practice, and you get comfortable with that, and you can feel it at any time, then you can also start to invite other people into that. But the cool thing is you don't actually have to tell them you're doing it, or have them even do it. So one of the things Armand, which I wish he was here again, he said that he started doing HRV practices and feeling his heartbeat. He noticed that not only did he change, but he actually noticed that his team members also started to change. The types of interactions they had, because he was the leader in the room. He wouldn't tell them to do heartbeat focus. He would just notice a change in the meetings. And over time, he said, hey, look, I think one of the reasons why we've had this change is because I've been doing this practice, and I'd like to invite you all to do it. So they all started doing it. And then over time, they scaled it out to the whole submarine when he was commanding subs. And from that, they won awards for the ability to actually operate within high risk environments in very, be very efficient and effective. So I think it has a real world application, and it can, as kind of a summary here, it kind of syncs up with this idea of the salient networks, default network and executive network. If we use heart rate coherence as kind of that switch, I think it starts to harmonize these networks and puts us, we can be in heartbeat focus and still be in an executive network. We can be, like I said, focusing on the heartbeat while you're moving your sword, but you can also use it to move into default network and really understanding when to be in either one. And I think of this coherence as kind of the foundational context from which all other states should emerge. So maybe you do need to be in like a play state or a flow state, a collaborative state or a discernment state. I would say like kind of go to coherence first, start there. And then maybe then what emerges from that. Maybe we need to be in this really high, like analytical, strategic thinking state. Let's start with coherence as a grounder, foundational, and then move into the strategic. And if you're interested in kind of exploring some ways to get feedback on this for yourself, right, for HRV and other things, there's 3 things I recommend. You can get an HRV monitor from HeartMath. That'll actually monitor your HRV in real time. You can get an Oura ring, which I wear actually an Oura ring. And this monitors HRV, heart rate, breathing rate, many things. So it looks at your readiness, and specifically it looks at when you're sleeping and what's going on when you sleep. And then you have the Whoop bracelet, which is a lot of athletes are wearing this now for just more in real time kind of information about their health. And HRV is one of the key things they're measuring. Interestingly, I think it was the Oura ring that they attributed a golfer noticed that his breath rate had increased a lot, and he went and got tested and he had COVID. And so the ring actually helped him to identify kind of early stages of that because he was seeing an increase in his heart rate. Because his breath rate, which was also increasing his heart rate. Okay. So as kind of a closing for this one, I think the next steps with this kind of design canvas is if you've thought about your goal, and next module we'll kind of talk a little bit about what kind of goal or solution you have a little bit. But right now, as you would take that and then you would think about what's the best context I need to be in to kind of achieve this goal. And also what's my optimal inner context, but also what's the best external context, or what is the external context that I'm operating in that might be influencing my internal context, right? So I kind of start to be aware of the internal, external environments, how they're influencing each other, but also kind of making note of what could be the most optimal. Does that make sense for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any questions from today?
It's really more comments,
Yeah.
and I think I'd like to think about it, but
Sure.
I've just been thinking a lot about the group dynamics when you've got someone in a leadership position who's going to take the lead and set the tone that others are going to follow.
Yeah.
There seems to be an important distinction here for the other people in the room to know that the leader isn't, while they may be setting the context, they're not taking over. It's like they're
Yes.
they're looking for this communal space and they're going to get there first, but it's a distinction between them taking over and being the dominant. They're dominant, not in the sense that they're going to overlay their values and decisions.
Yep.
So I think that there's some language around inviting other people to join that communal space while the leader sets the tone. It's different from what most people know about joining a group. And so I think at some point there's probably some language for you or a leader to use to explain the difference between that and maybe a typical team building session.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, when I am doing a facilitation, I mean, for example, working with the executive team of Rolls-Royce, and you walk into the room and you become the leader all of a sudden of the whole organization because you're leading their executive team in some capacity.
Right.
But I don't know anything about their organization really,
Right.
or even their market so much. But what I know how to do is create a coherent environment where we can integrate ideas and allow new ideas to emerge. And so I think that's a level of leadership that needs to be, like you said, very explicitly made.
Yeah.
And it's like, look, and as a leader in the room, I'm not the decision maker, right? So I've kind of decoupled decision making from leadership. I've said, no, my job as a leader right now is to just create the coherent environment.
Right.
And then from that, you are going to make the best decisions, get the best access. And that's different because typically we think the leader's like going to make the decision. They're going to tell people what to do.
Right.
And it's like you said, it's more of a inviting people into a space.
Yep.
That's cool. Gabriel, Adam, any thoughts? Or I know we're kind of over time here a little bit.
Oh, okay.
I'll let Adam go. I mean, I had quite a few, but
Okay.
I definitely like to marinate on them. But overall, just really great content. Really, really interesting stuff. And I really like where this is going.
Cool. Anything? Okay, good.
A couple thoughts.
Okay, sure.
About the heart again. Maybe not here nor there, but with the sword, like I forgot if I sent this to you, but did I send you that study where the rubber hand illusion? I don't know if they did the full body swap illusion was facilitated by overlaying your heart rate.
Oh, right.
Did I send you that?
No,
If
but
not,
I think so. I think you did, and that makes it even more like real to the person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because usually it's just a dummy hand there, right? But now it's with the heartbeat too.
There seems to be a sense in like this default anticipation that's like any complex adaptive system has to do to keep existing. You can think of in a way like it's like what is being anticipated by like the field of consciousness, by like your body world. Because like if all the brain is operating by this like principle of like prediction error minimization, then in a way you should be predicting yourself doing the things that's right for life management. And so it seems like I don't quite yet know how to say this, but I think this like relationship between like heart, consciousness, and like will, or like the direction of like intention and your ability to be a force over yourself and in the world, it seems to be a very deep connection of like like what consciousness must always be predicting is you coming back to this place of your body and its relationship to the world being like ultimately healthy, and then you should be trying to find your way back to this home, and so you're anticipating and living into it. And so I think you're onto something really profound.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. Well, thank you all. We'll do module 3. We'll be next. We'll be looking at kind of a more traditional perspective of foresight